Okay, ready to dive into some ancient mysteries.
Let's do it.
We're about to take a deep dive into a theory that suggests Freemasonry and maybe even some mainstream religions could be linked to, well, an ancient goddess-worshipping past.
A matriarchal one at that.
Exactly. And we'll be using excerpts from the book Freemasonry and the Hidden Goddess to guide us.
This is fascinating stuff. It's not just about decoding symbols. We might be uncovering a whole way of life, a history that's been, well, overlooked.
It really does feel like an alternate reality. The book starts with this idea of the Great Mother, a feminine figure, like a creatrix, who was worshipped in tons of ancient cultures. Does that concept actually hold water in, the academic world?
Well, think about it. Early humans saw women giving birth, literally creating life. It's not a stretch to imagine them connecting the feminine with creation itself.
That makes a lot of sense. The book mentions a ton of carvings and symbols at archaeological sites all over the world. They call them obscene. Sounds like those were kind of dismissed as just fertility symbols at first.
Right. But the sheer number of these symbols and the fact that they're found globally, it suggests they could be something way more important. Some scholars even argue that early humans may not have fully understood the male role in procreation.
Wow.
Which would make the Great Mother theory even stronger,
That's a mind-blowing idea, especially when you think about how, in our modern world, women's roles, anything feminine really, it often gets devalued.
Totally. Think about professions traditionally associated with women, like childcare. They're often undervalued, underpaid.
Oh, absolutely. The book even mentions how feminists who wanted women to get paid for raising children were ridiculed. It's crazy. Yeah. And meanwhile, we're spending trillions on the military, which is, traditionally a masculine field. It really makes you think.
It does. It shows this huge contrast in how we value different roles in society, a contrast that could actually have roots in those ancient power dynamics we were just talking about.
So how does Freemasonry fit into all of this?
Now, this is where things get really interesting. The author suggests that Freemasonry, well, it might actually hold clues to a suppressed goddess religion. Even their most basic symbols, like the compass and square, they might have hidden meanings.
What do you think those symbols might represent?
Well, if you look at how they're arranged, they make a W and an M. Could those stand for woman and mother?
Wow.
Maybe.
That's a pretty big revelation. And then there's the zigzag symbol, which the author connects to water, female genitalia, and the womb.
Yeah. They even go so far as to say that the zigzag is the origin of the letters W, M, Z, and N.
It's like a hidden code right there in plain sight.
Yeah.
But is the author saying that Freemasonry started as a goddess religion, or that they're secretly keeping these ancient teachings alive?
It's more nuanced than that. The book looks at the idea that some key figures and rituals in Freemasonry could be rooted in that older, feminine-centered spirituality. Like, take the story of Hiram Abiff. He's central to Masonic ritual, right? But they keep calling him the son of the widow, which is weird, especially in a patriarchal society.
That is odd. You'd think they'd trace his lineage through his father.
Exactly. The author's suggesting it could point to a matrilineal system, where inheritance and power go through the mother's line, which was common in ancient matriarchal societies.
Huh. Like a subtle hint at a whole different way of understanding lineage and power. And it kind of reminds me of Mary Magdalene. The book implies she might have been more than just a follower of Jesus, maybe even a priestess in a goddess religion.
Right. There's nothing explicit in the Bible, but you have to think about the historical context. When Christianity became the official religion, so many early Christian texts were destroyed. We might be missing, crucial pieces of the puzzle.
The book also points out that there was a lot of conflict back then between, the priests of Yahweh and the priestesses of these goddess temples. Yeah. That adds another layer to this whole thing.
Definitely. They even used the biblical story of Jezebel and her daughter Athaliah as an example. Both of them were powerful women who worshipped the goddess Astarte, and they were both murdered for their beliefs. Shows the tension between those two religious systems.
Wow. It makes you wonder about that whole temple prostitute label that's often attached to Mary Magdalene, too.
Yeah. The author theorizes that could have been a deliberate smear campaign by, the priests of Yahweh, a way to discredit those priestesses who saw sex as, a sacred act of creation.
So we're talking about a clash of, worldviews, spiritual practices. It's a power struggle, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what if Jesus and Mary Magdalene were trained in an Egyptian goddess religion and then sent to convert the Israelites? That's a pretty bold idea.
It is. Imagine trying to introduce a goddess-centered religion into a patriarchal society. The author suggests that they might have adapted their beliefs to fit in with the existing Jewish framework,
Oh, okay.
maybe transforming the mother goddess into a loving father god to avoid persecution.
Interesting strategy. Like, they were planting seeds of a new way of thinking without, directly challenging the powers that be. But then, why did Jesus face so much resistance from the religious authorities?
Well, maybe they sensed that even though his teachings seemed to align with Jewish tradition, they ultimately threatened the existing power structure, which was, of course, patriarchal.
So the author suggesting that Jesus' crucifixion was like politically motivated. He was a threat to the status quo.
It's definitely one possibility explored in the book, and it's interesting that Christianity eventually returned to Egypt and thrived there up until it became the Roman state religion.
But what happened after that?
Well, that's when things took a turn. The Roman Christians basically turned on their Egyptian counterparts. They massacred those who didn't conform and destroyed their texts.
It's almost ironic that the religion that may have originated in a goddess tradition ended up being used to suppress those very beliefs.
It is a pretty striking irony. It shows how history can be, well, rewritten, to fit a dominant narrative, often erasing or distorting the role of the feminine.
It's like a constant battle to uncover those hidden threads, the whispers of a different way of seeing the world. Speaking of whispers, the book talks about bees a lot, which are often associated with the Virgin Mary. What's the connection there?
Well, bees, with their whole thing of creating life on their own, parthenogenesis, they were ancient symbols of the Virgin Creatrix Mother. The author's suggesting that symbolism might connect back to the Great Mother, maybe even surviving within Christianity through Mary.
And that ties into the whole Mother of God thing that Roman Catholics use for Mary, right? The book points out that that phrase predates Christianity, originally referring to, the Great Mother.
Right.
Which raises some interesting questions for Christian theology. Like, if God created everything, who created God? The whole Mother of God thing seems kind of contradictory.
You could see that.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Hmm.
So what about the three great lights in Masonry? The book shows Noah's Ark, a book with John on it, and a beehive. What's the deal with those three images?
The author suggests they might represent the triple goddess, which is a concept that shows up in, various ancient traditions. The maiden, the mother, and the crone, symbolizing different stages of life, different facets of feminine power.
So Noah's Ark represents, like, the Old Testament and creation, the book John, maybe the New Testament and Jesus, and then the beehive links back to the Virgin Creatrix Mother. I think I'm starting to see how these threads of ancient symbolism run through history.
Exactly. The author even points out that the name Mary itself might come from ancient goddess names, like Mat and Mami, both of which mean mother.
It really makes you wonder how many echoes of the past we encounter without even realizing it. This kind of leads us to another intriguing symbol, the all-seeing eye. It's usually seen as a patriarchal symbol, a watchful, judging God.
Mm-hmm.
But the author challenges that interpretation.
They do. They point out that both the eye and the triangle are some of the oldest hieroglyphs for, the deity, suggesting a connection to the Great Mother. And of course, the all-seeing eye is right there on the dollar bill, which many believe is full of Masonic imagery.
And that brings up the number 13 and how it shows up repeatedly on the dollar bill. Most people just think of it as bad luck, right?
Yeah, the common explanation is that it represents the 13 original colonies, but the author digs deeper, connecting the number 13 to ancient lunar calendars, calendars based on the cycles of the moon.
And the moon is often linked to the feminine because of the, the menstrual cycle.
Right.
So the 13 lunar months of the year could have been seen as a feminine symbol. So maybe switching to a 12-month calendar was a way for patriarchal societies to kind of erase those associations.
It's an interesting theory, isn't it? Like, we're finding this secret code hidden in plain sight, which leads us to the back of the dollar bill and the pyramid with the all-seeing eye.
Okay.
The author points out that this pyramid is steeper than a typical Egyptian pyramid. It's more like a church steeple, which has phallic symbolism.
Wait, are you suggesting that pyramids themselves might be giant phallic symbols?
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it? The author links this imagery to the ancient pagan practice of carving large penises to represent, powerful gods. They even suggest that pyramids might have been built as a way to, symbolically attract the great goddess back to Earth.
Okay, that's a new one. Reminds me of the Masonic ritual of enacting the murder of Hiram Abiff, the builder of Solomon's temple. The guy who's called the son of the widow, which we talked about earlier.
Right, and the author suggests this might be a reference to Horus, son of Isis. Isis was widowed after her husband Osiris was murdered.
Yeah.
They're drawing a parallel between Masonic ritual and that ancient Egyptian myth, suggesting connections to, goddess traditions.
So if Freemasons hold all these secrets about a lost goddess religion, why haven't they revealed them? The book mentions that they were big proponents of religious freedom in the U.S. Constitution. Wouldn't that have been a chance to bring back those beliefs openly?
Good question. The author speculates that maybe the knowledge has just been lost over time, or maybe it's still taboo, even within Freemasonry. They also talk about how when they suggested we need to return to a feminine mater-centric age, they were met with, ridicule and resistance.
It's like this knowledge is buried so deep that it's almost impossible to bring it to light.
It does feel that way sometimes. And the author argues that this suppression isn't an accident. They point out that the concept of matriarchy is often dismissed, even censored in academia. People are trying to perpetuate this idea that male dominance is, the natural order of things.
We're programmed to believe this is how it's always been, how it's always going to be.
Right.
There's this image in the book, a trinity of goddesses, an ancient mother goddess nursing children, a Hellenistic goddess with an exposed breast, and then a kneeling goddess who kind of resembles the Virgin Mary. It's pretty striking.
It is.
What do you make of it?
Well, the author sees it as a visual representation of the feminine principle, throughout different eras. And then there's the all-seeing eye at the top of the image.
Right about that.
They suggest that represents the enduring presence of the hidden goddess. She's been suppressed, but not completely extinguished.
Powerful stuff. It really makes you think about the layers of meaning embedded in history.
It does. And it speaks to the book's main point, which is that these ancient teachings about the goddess, well, they might have been forced underground.
Okay.
They became mysteries practiced in secret within goddess temples.
So to survive, they had to adapt, hide their true beliefs as the patriarchal world took over. How much knowledge has been lost, how many stories silenced. It's crazy to think about.
It is. Makes you wonder where those stories might have survived. Take Corral, for example, the oldest known city in the Americas.
Corral is interesting because there's no evidence of warfare there.
Yeah.
Right. No fortifications, no weapons.
Exactly. And that contradicts this whole idea that conflict is just like human nature, part of how civilizations develop.
So are you saying Corral represents a society that lived in peace and harmony? A society that embodied the principles of, the goddess?
It's definitely a possibility. And Corral's not the only example. Another ancient city, Catalhoyuk, it's even older, and it also shows no signs of warfare.
Wow.
And, there's lots of feminine imagery there.
But if these ancient cities show that peaceful egalitarian societies existed, why aren't they more well known?
The author argues that, acknowledging those societies, acknowledging that humans are capable of peaceful coexistence, it's threatening to the powers that be, It challenges the way our world is structured right now.
It's like we're being prevented from learning from the past because it challenges the present.
Exactly. And this suppression even extends to how we interpret ancient symbols. Take the Masonic tracing boards, for instance, specifically the first degree board, which shows a ladder, like Jacob's ladder leading upwards.
What's so interesting about that image?
Well, the author points out that there are all these phallic symbols on the ground level suggesting, a patriarchal foundation.
Right.
But as you go up the ladder, you encounter 3 women who might represent the triple goddess.
So the path to, enlightenment, to higher knowledge, leads through the feminine.
It's an interesting interpretation.
And the author mentions the key hanging from the ladder, suggesting that the goddess is, the key to understanding Freemasonry.
Right.
Okay, so now let's jump to another tracing board, the third degree board, which shows a coffin. What's the symbolism there?
The author actually offers a few interpretations. It could represent the death of the ego, which you see in Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism.
Okay.
Or maybe it's a doorway to a new world, the afterlife even.
Like a portal or a transition point.
Exactly. And they also offer a more literal interpretation, connecting the coffin to a vagina symbol representing a return to the womb.
Wow, that's a lot to process.
It is.
But what about this whole conflict between Freemasonry and the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, Freemasons were seen as a threat to the church's authority, and they faced serious persecution in Catholic countries, even death penalties. The author actually highlights a drawing that shows a skull and crossbones near an image of the Virgin Mary.
Okay.
And the caption connects the vaginal shape of a cave with life and the skull with death. It's a pretty stark juxtaposition.
It really highlights the clash between these two belief systems, these two completely different ways of seeing the world.
Absolutely. And the book also has a drawing of an angel blowing a horn. You know, that image is usually associated with the Last Judgment in Christian symbolism, right?
Right.
But the author offers a different take. They suggest that within the context of the drawing, it might not symbolize the end of the world, but the end of patriarchy and a return to the goddess.
Like a prophecy, a vision of a future where the power shifts back to the feminine.
It's an interesting thought. And the author even points out that Jesus' teachings themselves, with their emphasis on love, forgiveness, non-resistance, well, those ideas seem more aligned with a goddess religion than with, the patriarchal God of the Old Testament.
Can you give me some examples of those teachings?
Sure. The book quotes passages from the Gospels where Jesus talks about, turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, going the extra mile, that kind of thing. These teachings challenge traditional ideas about good and evil and suggest a different path, a more peaceful and compassionate way of being in the world.
A world that sounds a lot like what might have existed in, Corral or Kittle-Holyoke.
Exactly. And the author even suggests that the whole archetype of the sacrificial God-man, which you see in so many religions, Jesus, Inanna, Odin, Buddha, it might have been planted in our collective unconscious to pave the way for a return to matriarchy.
Wait, are you saying that the sacrifice of a male deity is somehow connected to, the rise of feminine power?
It sounds counterintuitive, but the author suggests that this archetype might be subtly influencing men to, accept submission and sacrifice. And that could ultimately shift the balance of power.
It's like a strategy that's been playing out for centuries, working on us at a subconscious level. Speaking of powerful female figures, the book talks about Kali, the Hindu goddess who's often shown as fierce and destructive.
Yeah, Kali definitely challenges those traditional Western ideas of a benevolent, nurturing goddess. She's all about darkness, violence, death. The author suggests that she might represent the resistance of native populations, particularly against white invaders.
That's a powerful image. The book mentions she might be connected to other black goddess figures from around the world, like Sekhmet and the Black Virgins.
Right, and the author suggests that the worship of these black goddesses might actually predate patriarchal religions.
Really?
And their stories and images have been deliberately suppressed.
It's like we're uncovering this hidden history that challenges everything we thought we knew about the past.
Absolutely.
One of the most striking images associated with Kali is her being depicted, like standing or dancing on Shiva, the Hindu god who's often portrayed as white. What does that symbolize?
Well, the author explores the idea that it might represent the surrendering, the masochistic aspect of the male psyche, willingly submitting to feminine power.
That's definitely a provocative interpretation.
It is. The author connects it to, modern trends of male submission and the rise of dominant women in Western society. Those ancient myths are playing out in the modern world in ways we might not even realize.
So those ancient archetypes are still relevant today.
Absolutely. And the story of Kali battling demons is particularly relevant to the world we're living in right now.
So.
Well, the author suggests that these demons might represent, religious fundamentalism and right-wing politics, those forces that want to maintain male dominance and control. Well, the author sees it as a metaphor for the power of the women's movement. The call for equality and harmony, which is symbolized by the hum, challenges those patriarchal systems that are built on, inequality and dominance.
Like a rising tide of feminine energy sweeping away the old structures.
Exactly. And the lion in the story, which represents Devi's power, it symbolizes the men who support the women's movement. It's a reminder that this isn't just a battle between genders, it's a struggle for a just and equitable world for everyone.
So are you saying that the author believes we're on the verge of a major societal shift? A shift back towards the feminine principle?
They certainly seem to think so. They even explore the idea that science and atheism, which were initially seen as threats to patriarchal religions, might ultimately be, defeated and controlled by feminine forces.
Wow, that's a bold prediction. What evidence do they offer to support that claim?
They point to passages in Revelation that describe the beast being overcome and imprisoned, seeing it as a symbol of shifting power dynamics.
Interesting. What about that description of Great Babylon as a wealthy and powerful prostitute in Revelation? What do they make of that?
They suggest it symbolizes the downfall of a materialistic society that's controlled by women, connecting it to the increasing power and influence of women in the 21st century, it could be a foreshadowing of a major societal shift.
So we could be talking about a complete reversal of traditional power structures, a world where women are calling the shots.
It's a possibility. They also point to that passage in Revelation that describes a woman dressed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, interpreting it as like the rise of a powerful feminine force.
It's like the ancient worship of sun goddesses and moon gods is being flipped, with the feminine now at the center. But this brings us back to the question of Freemasonry's role in all of this. Are they like the keepers of this ancient knowledge, or have they corrupted it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The author acknowledges that there were historical clashes between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church, suggesting that Freemasonry might have actually supported alternative spiritual traditions. But they also talk about the internal conflicts within Freemasonry, where some members wanted to get rid of those ancient rituals and teachings that they considered, embarrassing.
So there's a battle going on within Freemasonry, like between those who want to preserve the old ways and those who want to, modernize or even suppress those teachings.
Exactly. And that reflects this larger tension between, like, the forces of patriarchy and the forces of, feminine empowerment.
So where do the Freemasons stand in this whole battle? Are they on the side of the angels or the demons?
That's a question that each individual Freemason has to answer for themselves. The author suggests that there are both wolves and goats within the organization. Those who are seeking power for personal gain and those who are genuinely committed to, like, the betterment of humanity.
It's like any large group. You're going to have people with different agendas.
Exactly. And the author argues that the future of Freemasonry, maybe even the future of humanity, depends on which side wins out.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack. But I'm eager to, delve deeper into these ideas. What should we explore next?
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about how these ancient beliefs, they could inform our present, maybe even shape our future. The author argues that suppressing the feminine principle has led to a lot of the problems we see today: environmental destruction, war, violence.
I can see the link between, like, patriarchy and war and violence, but environmental destruction, how are those connected?
Well, the author suggests that this worldview that sees nature as something to be, dominated and exploited, it's fundamentally masculine.
Okay.
They argue that we need a more feminine perspective, one that recognizes that everything is connected and values nurturing and sustainability. That's what we need to address the environmental crisis.
So we need to shift from a mindset of, like, control and domination to one of respect and harmony. But where do we even start? How do we rediscover this, lost feminine wisdom, this connection to the Great Mother?
The author suggests that the clues are all around us, hidden in plain sight. We just need to pay attention to the symbols, the myths, the stories that have been passed down through generations.
It's like we're on a treasure hunt, searching for the lost pieces of a puzzle. And what's the treasure in this case?
A deeper understanding of ourselves, our connection to the cosmos, and the potential for a more balanced, harmonious world.
Okay, I'm in. Let's find that treasure. So where do we start this treasure hunt?
The first step is to examine our own beliefs, our own assumptions. The author challenges us to question everything we've been taught, to look beyond the surface and dig deeper for those hidden meanings.
So we're basically being asked to think for ourselves, to question the status quo, to be open to new perspectives.
Exactly. And that can be radical, especially in a world that often tries to limit our thinking, keep us in these, narrow boxes.
It's like we're breaking free from, like, mental chains. But that freedom comes with a responsibility, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's essential if we're going to create a better world, a world that honors the feminine principle, the power of creation, nurturing, interconnectedness.
It's definitely a vision worth fighting for. But how do you fight a system that's so deeply entrenched, so pervasive?
The author suggests that knowledge is power. By understanding this hidden history, these suppressed truths, we can start to see the cracks in the system.
Okay.
The vulnerabilities.
Like finding the weak spot in the giant's armor. But don't we risk becoming the very thing we're fighting against? If we use, manipulation and control to achieve our goals, aren't we just perpetuating that cycle of domination?
That's a valid concern. The author emphasizes intention.
Right.
We need to be really clear about our motives to make sure that we're not just replacing one system of domination with another.
So it's not about power over others,
Yeah.
but empowering everyone to, reach their full potential.
Precisely. And that requires a fundamental shift in how we think, a move away from that win-lose mentality that's so common in our society.
It's about creating a world where everyone wins. Okay, but how do we get there? What are the practical steps we can take to create this more harmonious world?
The author suggests starting with self-awareness, looking at our own beliefs and behaviors and identifying ways that we might be, perpetuating these patriarchal patterns.
This is about looking in the mirror before we point fingers.
Exactly. And being willing to change, to challenge our own assumptions, to embrace new ways of thinking and being.
It sounds like personal transformation is the key to societal transformation.
Precisely. And the author suggests that this personal transformation can be helped by connecting with the feminine principle, like tapping into the wisdom of the Great Mother.
That makes sense. But how do you do that?
Yeah.
The Great Mother is a pretty abstract concept.
Well, the author suggests that we can access the feminine principle through, things like nature, art, music, dance, activities that connect us to our creativity, intuition, and emotions.
It's about finding ways to express our authentic selves, to tap into our inner wisdom.
Yes. And by doing so, we can start to heal the wounds of patriarchy within ourselves and in the world around us.
That sounds like a pretty tall order.
It is, but we're not alone in this. Throughout history, there have always been individuals and groups who kept that flame of feminine wisdom burning, even during the darkest times.
Like the Freemasons, maybe.
Maybe, but the author also points to the emergence of, the New Thought movement in the 19th century, which eventually led to the New Age movement and this renewed interest in, esoteric teachings.
So there's a growing awareness of these alternative spiritualities, these different ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. And the author sees that growing awareness as a sign that the tide is turning, that the feminine principle is reasserting itself.
It's like a spiritual awakening, a shift in consciousness.
And that shift is essential if we're going to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
I'm feeling inspired, but what about the skeptics? The people who dismiss all this as New Age nonsense.
The author acknowledges that there will always be resistance to new ideas, especially ones that challenge the status quo. But the evidence is there. I mean, the symbols, the myths, the ancient teachings, they all point to a time when the feminine was revered, a time when humanity lived in greater balance and harmony with nature.
And that's a story worth telling, a story worth sharing.
Absolutely. And it's a story that's unfolding right now, all around us.
So what's our role in this story? What can we do to help write a, happy ending?
The author suggests that each of us has a part to play, whether it's speaking our truth, challenging injustice, or just living our lives in a way that reflects our values.
It's about being the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. And even small acts of courage and compassion can have a ripple effect. They create waves of change that can transform our world.
I love that image. We're all drops in the ocean, and together we can create this powerful current.
And that current, that collective energy, it's what's going to propel us towards a more enlightened future. A future where the feminine principle is honored and celebrated. A future where we live in peace and harmony with each other and the earth.
It's a future worth dreaming of.
Yeah.
A future worth fighting for.
Yeah.
It's crazy how all these symbols and ideas we've been talking about, they're woven into our lives and we don't even realize it.
It really is. Once you start noticing those patterns, it's hard to ignore them.
Exactly. A whole new world opens up, full of hidden meanings.
Mm-hmm.
The author encourages us to be symbol detectives, looking for clues in our everyday lives.
Mm-hmm.
Clues that point to a deeper meaning, a connection to the past.
They suggest we pay attention to architecture, art, even pop culture.
So those hidden Mickey Mouse heads they put in Disney movies?
Well, maybe not exactly like that. But the idea is to train ourselves to look beyond the surface, see the symbolism in everything around us.
It's like we're all on this giant scavenger hunt with clues scattered everywhere.
And the prize, a deeper understanding of ourselves, our history, and the forces that shape our world.
Okay, I'm ready to grab my magnifying glass and decoder ring. But with all this information, where do we even begin?
The author recommends starting with the familiar. You know, those symbols and images we encounter every day. We've talked about the all-seeing eye and the number 13 on the dollar bill, but there's more to discover there.
I'm all ears. What else is hiding on that little green piece of paper?
Well, look at the Latin phrase above the pyramid, annuit coeptus. It means he, God, has favored our undertakings.
Okay, but what's so special about that? Seems like a pretty standard motto for a nation that was founded on, the idea of divine providence.
The author suggests it could also be a nod to the Great Mother, the feminine force guiding humanity's evolution, behind the scenes.
So, like a subtle acknowledgement of the power of the feminine, even within a system that's mostly focused on, masculine power.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And the author suggests that similar clues are all over our culture, just waiting for us to decipher them.
It's like we've been living in the Matrix, and now we're starting to see the code. But what's the point of all of this? Even if we figure out all these hidden meanings, how does that change anything in the real world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The author believes that rediscovering this lost feminine wisdom can actually help us heal the wounds of patriarchy and create a more balanced, harmonious world.
So it's not just about intellectual curiosity, it's about practical application.
Exactly. It's about using this knowledge to transform our lives, our communities, and ultimately the world.
I'm all for a more balanced and harmonious world, but how do we bridge the gap between these abstract concepts and actually doing something? Can you give me some examples?
Well, the author suggests starting with simple practices. Spending time in nature, connecting with your creativity, practicing compassion and empathy.
Okay, those are all good things, but how do they contribute to, the larger societal transformation we've been talking about?
They believe that as more and more individuals embrace these values, it'll create a shift in our collective consciousness, a move away from those patriarchal values of, competition, domination, exploitation.
Like that butterfly effect, where one small change can set off a whole chain reaction, leading to bigger transformation.
Exactly. And they believe this transformation is already happening, that we're in the middle of a global awakening to the power of the feminine principle.
Okay, that's encouraging. But what about the people who are actively resisting this change? Those who are clinging to the old ways? It feels like there's a lot of pushback against these ideas.
There's always resistance to change, especially when it threatens those in power. But the author argues that the momentum is with those who are embracing the feminine principle.
So it's like a tug of war between the old and the new, and the balance is slowly tipping towards the new.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The author also points out that a lot of the challenges we're facing right now is climate change, social injustice, political polarization. They're all rooted in that patriarchal worldview, the one that values domination and control over cooperation and harmony.
So rediscovering the feminine principle isn't just about ancient history and symbols. It's about finding solutions to the problems we're facing today.
Exactly. The author sees the resurgence of the feminine as a key to creating a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
Wow. This has been a seriously thought-provoking conversation. What gives you hope when you look at all these challenges?
What gives me hope is the resilience of the human spirit, our capacity for love, compassion, creativity. Even in the darkest times, there's this light within us that can't be extinguished.
It's like a spark of divinity that can never be fully quenched, no matter how hard the forces of darkness try to snuff it out.
Beautifully said. And that light is growing brighter because there are so many people out there, individuals and groups, who are working towards a better world. People like the author of this book and countless others who are challenging those old stories and offering new perspectives.
And people like our listeners who are tuning in, asking questions, trying to understand themselves and the world around them better.
Exactly. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being part of the solution. It's about taking action, however small, to contribute to a better future.
As the author says, even the smallest acts of kindness and compassion can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Like we're planting seeds of hope and change and trusting that they'll take root and blossom.
And they will blossom. They'll create a world that's more just, more equitable, more beautiful than we can even imagine.
Well, that's a beautiful thought to end on. This deep dive has been a truly enlightening journey. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into, the fascinating world of ancient symbols, hidden meanings, and that enduring power of the feminine. What will you explore further after this deep dive? Until next time, keep those minds open, keep questioning everything, and never stop searching for truth.